Hello, fellow medievalist. This is our latest dispatch from the bunker. Hope you're all doing well in your bunkers. First thing I want to note, I'm sure you've noticed this, is that there is an exam later this week. It will become available to you first thing Friday morning. It is due by midnight on Sunday evening. The exam is simply an essay. So what you'll receive on Friday is an essay question, and then you have a couple of days to complete it. So just kind of plan for that, and also be aware that the next reading, which is Meister Eckhart, the discussion questions are due on Monday by midnight. So it gives you a little incentive to maybe finish the exam on the earlier side, optimally maybe by the end of the day on Saturday, to give yourself a little bit more time with the Eckhart reading. I'm not going to give you the essay question right now, but I'm going to give you a pretty big hint. And I'm going to tell you that the essay question is in some way going to be about, um, obviously the theologians that we've read in Unit 2, and specifically their assumptions about sort of the goals, the aims of theology, and their corresponding notions about the proper method of theology. How do you go about doing theology? What does that look like? And of course, that's going to be determined largely by your understanding of what theology is after, what it's trying to achieve in some way. So be thinking about that. And in this video, I want to give a fair amount of attention to Thomas Aquinas's assumptions about the proper method and goals for theology, especially method. And then we'll get into some of the substantial theological issues that you guys raised in your questions for this week. So the first thing I want to say in terms of method, I hope that you noticed maybe some of the ways in which Thomas's sort of format in the Summa Theologiae reflects that university context that I talked about in one of my last videos. He was a product of the university, taught in the university, and I think you see this in a number of ways. First of all, I think you see it simply in the argumentative style. I don't mean argumentative is a pejorative term at all, but clearly he has absorbed the view of the university, the medieval university, which is that theology is largely a matter of disputation, of arriving at firm conclusions through rigorous argument. And he kind of builds that into the actual format of the Summa itself, in the way that there are objections and then there are sort of responses to objections. So even though there's only one author, Thomas Aquinas, there is a kind of dialogical or dialectical form at play, and that kind of replicates the disputatious atmosphere of the university, where you're expected to make bold theological claims and back them up and respond to objections and so on and so forth. Something else to note that really does mark Thomas Aquinas as a product of a university setting, university training, is his knowledge and use of Aristotle. Now, just as a matter of happenstance, the small sliver of the Summa that we were assigned does not actually contain any direct citations of Aristotle. That's a little bit anomalous, because in the entire Summa, he cites Aristotle upward of 2,000 times. Normally, he won't say Aristotle, he'll just say the philosopher, which tells you something about the esteem that he had for Aristotle. But even in today's reading, where Aristotle does not appear explicitly, he still makes use of a number of Aristotelian categories and concepts. So he draws on Aristotle's notions of causality, like the axiom that an effect cannot be stronger than or more powerful than the cause. He also uses the category of accident. Some of you have encountered this Aristotelian terminology, substance and accidents. A substance is what something is in itself. An accident is a quality that a thing might have or might lose without sort of changing its substance. So at one point he talks about grace as an accident, right? So a human being could have grace, a human being could not have grace. Either way, you are still a human being. So grace in that sense is accidental. So Aristotle is present even in our short reading for the week. So what, those are just a few comments on method. Um, or on the university setting. I'll come back to method in just a moment. I do want to pose the question, what was Thomas trying to achieve as a theologian? What were his goals and aims as a theologian? What is the point of this kind of theology? I don't want to say too much about that because I want you really to think about that and reflect on that. I will say that I think by and large, he is following Anselm's paradigm of theology as faith seeking understanding. So he is accepting simply as givens the dogmas of the church, the authoritative doctrines taught by the church, enshrined in creeds and councils and things like that. So the question is, what is he up to here in just taking our reading as a case study? What do you think Aquinas is trying to accomplish? And it is very important, I think, even though, reasonably we can only read a little bit of the Summa, we have to remember that it's a much larger work, that Thomas is assuming that people are going through the whole thing. And so, Thomas is not treating grace in isolation. And I will plan to upload a sort of table of contents from the Summa onto Canvas so you can just get a sense of the breadth and the depth of the entire Summa. So the point is that our reading is just one puzzle piece in a much, much larger puzzle or mosaic. So I'm not going to say much more about that, about sort of goals and aims. I do want to say more about method, precisely because we've never read a work of theology quite like this one. I mean, that's why I sort of had to give you a heads up on simply, how to read a question from the Summa Theologiae. So for Thomas Aquinas, how does one go about making a compelling theological argument? Couple things to say. First, you have to be cognizant of and anticipate potential or at least apparent weaknesses of your own position. So you don't present your view as if no one could possibly have any objections to it at all. In fact, as Thomas actually does, you include the objections. And then, of course, you eventually deal with them and explain why they are not fatal to your position. But you anticipate some of the criticism that your view might attract. Doesn't mean that you're going to diffuse all criticism. But I do want to emphasize, though, that Aquinas, in each and every one of these articles, in the entire Summa, the objections are not frivolous. They are not straw man kinds of arguments. I mean, let's just take Article 1 from our reading, and of course you want to have that out. If you look at a couple of these objections, the first and the second one, I mean, these are serious theological objections that actually have some weight, right? Because the question is God alone a cause of grace? Now, ultimately, Thomas, of course, says yes. But one of the objections says, well, look, wait a minute. Grace comes through Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was God, yes, but also human, right? Fully human. So how, and human beings, human nature is not God, it's created. So how can we say that grace comes through God alone? Or the second objection, which has to do with the sacraments, right? Sacraments which were understood to be channels of God's grace. Now, sacraments, however high and holy they may be, are still created material things. So how can we say that grace only comes through God alone? Now, of course, in the end, he deals with those objections and explains why they don't invalidate his view. But those are not um, sort of fake objections. Those are really thoughtful objections. So that's part of the key to success in theology for Thomas Aquinas, anticipating possible weaknesses in your argument. The second point I want to make about Thomas's view on what makes for compelling theology is somewhat related to the first point, and that is the importance of authority. Okay? Medieval theologians really were not generally trying to come up with brand new ideas that no one had thought of before. They were staking out particular theological positions. And in the process of staking out those positions, one of the main ways that you try to get people to take your position seriously is to show that there are authorities, authoritative writers that basically agree with you. Okay, so theology is more than just sort of lining up and marshaling authorities, but that's a big part of what theology is, at least when we're talking about medieval, scholastic, university theology. So this raises the question, who or what are the authorities in play here? And if you ever have a chance to look at the first question of the Summa, so the first question of the first part of the Summa, Thomas addresses this question head on and talks about there being a kind of hierarchy of authorities. Okay, so not all authorities are equally authoritative. Unsurprisingly, the supreme and unique authority in theology is Holy Scripture. Okay, so it possesses a kind of status as an authority that nothing else possesses. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other authorities. There are going to be lesser authorities, but it doesn't mean that you don't need to worry about what anybody else says. No, you need to take other voices seriously. First and foremost, the church fathers. Okay, so we're talking about sort of the most widely renowned Christian authors of the first 7 or so centuries of Christianity. Now, for Aquinas, that above all means Augustine, but there's a bunch of other church fathers. In fact, Dionysius the Areopagite is, I believe, the second or third most cited patristic authority by Thomas. So there's a number of patristic authorities in play. Now, he's very clear about this elsewhere. The authority of the church fathers is sub-scriptural. So whereas, the Gospel of John, say, cannot err, Augustine can make a mistake. We are not obligated to accept everything that the church fathers said. However, we are actually obligated to take them seriously. And so if we have a position, and it would seem that Augustine has a different position, then at the very least, we have a kind of duty to justify departing from Augustine, even if in the end that is in fact what we do. And there's another level of authorities. Now, this is further down on the hierarchy, and these would be the philosophers. So people who did not know Christ, but made excellent use of their natural reason. As I already suggested, for Thomas, Aristotle is definitely at the top of that list, but that doesn't mean that, Plato and the Stoics didn't have some important things to say as well. Now, it was interesting, a couple of you asked about Bonaventure. You notice some affinities between Bonaventure and Aquinas. I think Ellie and Colby both mentioned that. Somebody like that, a contemporary like Bonaventure, and Thomas and Bonaventure were almost exact contemporaries. A contemporary is not going to count as an authority, and you would not cite, typically anyway, you would not cite an authority like, hey, Bonaventure agrees with me on this. Now, reading other contemporary theologians is a good thing to do, and in fact, you really have to do it if you're going to be a scholastic theologian. But they're not really authorities. Now, Mandy noticed something interesting, which is that he does cite Anselm as an authority, even though Anselm is not, by any definition, a church father. So that is interesting, and it does show that with the passage of time, non-patristic theologians might function as authorities as well. Just keep in mind, Anselm was already dead for about 150 years by the time Thomas is writing. Okay, so just to recap real quick there, two of the things that you want to do, if you have the mindset of Thomas Aquinas, to build an impressive and persuasive theological case is to anticipate possible objections and to cite authorities that support your case and be prepared to deal with objections that you have not taken such and such authority seriously enough. All right. Well, most of your questions, the vast majority of your discussion questions, have to do not really with his method or his understanding of theology, as a large project. But most of your questions, understandably, had to do with some of the actual sort of substantive material claims that he makes about grace. And I noticed a kind of pattern emerging, and there were a lot, and again, I'm never going to be able to respond to all of your questions, but I noticed that many of the questions sort of formed two big clumps. So one clump of questions had to do with his idea that there could be gradations of grace. And this is largely found in Article 4, where the question is grace greater in one man than in another? To which he answers yes, right? And I think that was very puzzling to a number of you. I think one way to make sense of this is to go back to the actual definition of grace he gives us in the first article. He gives a nice, succinct definition of grace. So take a look at that. This is in the I respond section, first page of the reading. The gift of grace exceeds every power of created nature, since it is nothing other than a certain participation in God's nature, which exceeds every other nature. Skip on. For it is as necessary that God alone should deify by communicating a share of the divine nature through a certain participation in his likeness. Okay. So this is interesting and perhaps a bit surprising. Thomas is going to define grace as basically synonymous with deification, theosis, divinization, a concept that we keep on cycling back to again and again in this class. So grace is deification. And deification for Thomas is not absolute. It's not as if, either you're deified or you're not. There is a kind of spectrum. Deification is something that admits of degrees. Okay? So if you think about it that way, then that might help you to understand why he talks about grace in these sort of quantitative terms, right? That someone might have more or less of it. He is not in any way sort of suggesting someone is more or less forgiven or more or less saved. He's talking about grace in a slightly narrower sense, in the sense of deification. And finally, it has to be noted that Aquinas is very much like other medieval thinkers and very much unlike most modern thinkers in that he's simply comfortable with the idea of hierarchy, even when that's applied to human beings. So I think it's partly a cultural difference, a difference of sensibility between medieval people and moderns or postmoderns like us. Okay, the biggest cluster of questions that I got from you guys was on a slightly different issue, which is his statements about grace and free will. He seems to want to affirm a very robust sense of grace, so that God sort of causes grace. God moves our free will to accept grace, um, but then also to, well, as I just did, talk about free will. And several of you noticed this and raised the question, well, how can you, on the one hand, talk about God, moving someone's free will and still maintain any real sense of freedom? So those are excellent questions. Those are questions that people have been posing to Thomas Aquinas for centuries. So I want to delve a little bit into this. And my goal is not to convince you that Thomas is right or that he has a kind of watertight argument here. I just want to give you a little bit of a broader context that might help you understand why he talks and thinks as he does here. The first point to make is that for Thomas, divine causation is not like creaturely causation. Now, we talk about causation with respect to God and with respect to creatures. We say God causes X, and we say, a creature causes Y. So we use the same terminology and we apply it to God in one instance, we apply it to creatures in another. But what we have to remember is that those divine and created causation work on two entirely different levels. When God causes things, he actually causes them to be. He causes them to exist, which is not what creatures do typically, right? Creatures cause already existent things to exist in a certain way. When we cause things, we don't sort of bring them into being in the way that God does when God causes things to be. Now, in many ways, Thomas here is just following a couple of concepts from Aristotle, the concept of primary causation, which would be that divine causation, and secondary causation, so creaturely causation. And they're operating at two different levels so that they're not really in direct competition with one another. Furthermore, when creatures do act as causes, human beings act as causes, the sun acts as causes, and so on. Even when we act as causes, we do not do so independently from God. We're causing certain things to be in a certain way, but we're only in a position to be causing them because we depend on God for our very existence. We depend on divine causation for our very existence. Okay? So there's a fundamental asymmetry there between divine and human causation. For Aquinas, to act freely means that we're not being constrained by other creatures to act in a certain way. For Aquinas, we can be dependent on God in some ways, but also freely act and freely will and freely cause. Okay? So in other words, we don't have to achieve independence from God in order to act freely. God does not so much act on us as make us who we are. And what are we? We are rational creatures. We are freely willing agents. Why are we freely willing agents? Because God caused us to be freely willing agents. Okay. So that's all sort of one big point, which is that divine and human causation exist on two different and non-competitive levels. A second point, just to bear in mind here, the overall framework of Thomas's theology, or we might say sort of the overall tenor of his theology, is actually apophatic. And Andrea actually noticed this and asked a question about this. Because we do get a little glimpse of this in our reading today, but particularly I think in Article 5, where he's talking about how we can't know for certain that we have received grace. And that's because we don't actually know, in the sense of sort of comprehending the source of grace, which is God. And that, of course, is an apophatic kind of point. Now, needless to say, Thomas does not read like Dennis the Areopagite. Of course, I've already mentioned the fact that he was highly influenced and indebted to Dennis. And throughout the Summa, Thomas is very clear. We do not actually know God. We do not know God in the sense that we do not know what God is. We cannot achieve a rational comprehension of God. Now, that's the apophatic point. Now, he obviously also works in a kind of cataphatic register because, he's making claims about God and that sort of thing. And so what you do when you speak cataphatically is you have to always sort of remember that our language and our concepts and our categories never quite fit God. So, for instance, again, we talk about God causing something. We talk about human beings causing something. We talk about chlorophyll causing something. Okay, we talk about a chemical reaction causing something. We're using the same word there every time. And of course, that word, that concept of causation is something that we have gleaned from our own creaturely finite experience. Now, it may be legitimate to apply that language and to apply those categories to God, but it can only be legitimate if we remember that our language and our ideas are always imperfect when applied to God. So that has to be kept in mind as well, because we don't really understand exactly how divine causation works in the same way that we understand how creaturely causation works. So we can't pretend to be able to give a full account of something that is beyond our rational comprehension. Third point I want to make about this larger issue of grace and free will. For Thomas Aquinas, and here he's following Aristotle. For Aristotle, all things, all natural creatures, and this includes human beings, have a final cause. That is to say, they have an end. They have a purpose for which they exist. And for human beings, now we're talking about Thomas, for human beings, the final cause, the purpose, the goal of human beings by nature is the beatific vision of God. The vision of God, the full vision of God that we will eventually receive, that will make us happy and make us whole. That's what beatific means. It just means happy making, the happy making vision of God. Okay. That's why we were created. That's why we exist, so that we might reach our full fulfillment through this vision of God. Now, when God moves the free will of a human being by preparing her for grace, by actually giving her grace, what God is actually doing is not annulling or canceling out our free will, but rather God is liberating us. And I use that word liberating very deliberately because, of course, that's related to the word liberty, freedom, freedom of will. God liberates our will by allowing it to pursue that to which it is already ordered by its own nature. In other words, when God moves our free will to accept grace, God is actually empowering us to become the kind of creatures that we are supposed to be. The best analogy I could think of for this is imagine, we've all seen like videos of this on the internet. Imagine an animal, a wild animal that's injured, taken into captivity, nursed back to health, and then released back into the wild. Okay. Now, in this particular analogy, it's not the animal that opens the gate. It's the human being. It's the people who have been caring for this animal. They're the ones who open the door of their cage and therefore make it possible for the animal to re-enter the wild. But why do we always find those videos so heartwarming? It's because the animal is being freed to be what it is, to be true to its own nature. Its nature is not to be cooped up in some sort of rehab center for animals. Its nature is to be frolicking in the wild, right? So that's what God is doing. God is the one sort of opening the cage and allowing us to become who we were meant to be. Now, just a couple other points, and we'll wrap things up. Several of you also asked, like, aren't there implications here in terms of what he says about grace and freedom? Aren't there implications here about like predestination? That's a very good question because yes, indeed, there are implications. And this is, again, another time to be reminded that this is one small piece of a much larger work. And indeed, Thomas has already dealt with the question of predestination pretty thoroughly in the first part of the Summa. Remember, there's 3 parts of the Summa, and the second part is divided into 2 parts. And what we're reading is from the first part of the second part. Okay, but in the first part, he talks about predestination. So this is something he's already covered. So this is, it's not as if like it just hasn't occurred to Thomas that he should also deal with predestination. He has in fact already dealt with it. And what has happened? By the time Thomas has started to write the Summa, his views on predestination have basically aligned with those of the later Augustine. And this was not always true. Aquinas did not always hold an Augustinian understanding of predestination. But he read a big helping of late period Augustine and was basically convinced by this. I mean, he agreed with Augustine on every fine point, but did agree with Augustine that God predestined certain people to salvation, and God did this from eternity before the foundation of the world, and that predestination is not predicated on God's foreknowledge of our merits, but rather is given regardless of our merits or demerits. Okay, so he basically does come to that view. So those of you who did see sort of that view of predestination between the lines of our reading, you were in fact correct to do so. And I should mention that in the Middle Ages, in the Latin West, this particular view was kind of a minority view. So Aquinas is going out on a bit of a limb here. Now, of course, he's got Augustine on his side, and that's always a nice guy to have in your corner. But this is not really a mainstream view. Now, of course, several of you noted that this view which was not the majority view in the Middle Ages, becomes the view of most of the Protestant reformers, of Luther and Calvin. And you're absolutely right to note that. So it's very interesting. We think of Thomas Aquinas as just sort of being, in a different universe than Luther or Calvin, but on their understanding of grace and freedom and predestination, there's a lot of overlap. Not perfect overlap, but a lot of overlap. Now, does this mean that Luther, Calvin, and company read Aquinas, were influenced by Aquinas? Probably not. Okay, Luther, as best as anyone could tell, never actually read any Aquinas. Calvin does cite Aquinas occasionally, but some scholars think that he didn't really read Thomas directly, that he just found some choice quotes in some other works and then deployed those. So I point this out because, we now think about Thomas Aquinas as the definitive Catholic medieval theologian. But even as late as the 16th century, the time of Luther and Calvin, when you received a theological education in a Roman Catholic setting, university or whatever, you were not necessarily going to read Thomas Aquinas. Now, that's going to change for sure. But even as late as the early 16th century, Thomas Aquinas was not required reading for aspiring Catholic theologians. I think that's pretty interesting. Last point, and this is related. One significant issue of disagreement between Aquinas and the later Protestant reformers has to do with the assurance of salvation. This brings us back to Article 5. Can a person know if he or she has grace? Thomas's answer is quite clear. No. Under normal circumstances, we cannot know. Now, he does allow for the possibility of some extraordinary special act of revelation where God reveals to someone that they have been given and possess grace. But Thomas assumes that that's not ordinarily going to be the case. Now, you could ask the question, well, is Thomas just sort of leaving people to marinate in their own fear and anxiety because they can't know for sure if they have grace or not? I think the answer is no. Notice he does talk about another way of knowing something, a lesser way of knowing something. You can know something, he says, conjecturally through signs. We might say clues or indications. What he means to say is that we can know that we have grace based on a couple of things, based on whether or not we find delight in God, whether we are guilty of mortal sin. Okay? If you find delight in God, if you do not perceive yourself to be tainted by mortal sin, then you have grounds for optimism about the fact that you have grace. He does admit, though, that this is an imperfecta form of knowledge. Okay, so it's not certainty. It's a kind of lower form of knowledge. And it is possible, he says, that we may be guilty of some secret sin that we ourselves are not really cognizant of. Now, this is the point at which we page Dr. Luther, because if you know anything about the young Martin Luther when he was still living in a monastery or friary, he was consumed by anxiety that he might commit some sin and not be aware of it, and therefore be accountable for it on the day of judgment. So Luther and later Calvin eventually become convinced that it is absolutely essential that we have certainty, assurance of salvation, assurance that we possess saving grace. So the point is that even though there's lots of interesting parallels here between Aquinas on one hand and Luther and Calvin on the other, even on these issues about grace and predestination and all that, there are some significant differences as well. Okay, catch you later.